to where I am, it's beginning to go in the other direction. Although the neat thing is we do have now a second window of opportunity in early adolescence and maybe even middle or late adolescence if we pay attention to new areas of the brain that are developing. And since we only use about 10% of the brain, there's a lot of capacity, I think, there for us to learn how to stimulate, to add to the function of what's going on with our children and as they become adults. But look at the bottom line. The bottom line reflects where this country invests its resources. And during the first 5 or 6 years, there's almost, comparatively, almost no investment, certainly very little investment. Some of that is changing a little bit around early education. We now have not only Head Start, but we have early Head Start programs, which are not early enough, but at least better than not having anything at all. But look at that. Look at the discord between what we know in economic science and now, as we'll talk about during the next 45 minutes or so, in terms of our own neurosciences and how that doesn't match up with where this country is willing to make investments. I want to tell you a couple of quick stories and present cases. This is the first one. But first, I want to tell you one more thing about Professor Heckman. He says, as you can see here, that the economic and social problems in our country, which are crime, teenage pregnancy, high school dropouts, adverse health conditions, the list goes on, can be traced to low levels of skill and social ability. And some of the symptoms include attentiveness, persistence, impulse control, and a list of similar symptoms. So one of the things that I was able to do during my tenure at OU was teach in our pediatric clinic, because I basically was a generalist before I went off into sort of the child abuse subspecialty. And residents would say, and students would see cases much the same as they do in the clinics here, and then they would come out and talk to me as the attending about what they had seen, what they thought was going on, what their treatment plan would be, and then would expect me to nod in affirmation and pat them on the back, and we'd go in and take care of the patient. So one day, one of the residents came out of a room. She was seeing a 7-year-old boy who was in 2nd grade, doing terribly. The school had referred him because he was inattentive. He had no persistence in pursuing a task, and he had no impulse control and was running around the room and hitting people and doing all sorts of things. So they wanted him evaluated. So she saw him, and she came out afterwards, and she said, well, Dr. Block, I've evaluated this little boy, and he indeed has problems with attention. He has problems with impulse control. I really think he has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and would like to treat him with Ritalin. What do you think? And being a bit of a rascal, I said, well, tell me something about the ecology of this child. Bless you. And she said, ecology? I took ecology in college because it was a gut course, and I had to get to medical school, but ecology was like what grass grows first next to a river, and then what tree comes and embeds in the grass, and then what insects come and other animals. What's that got to do with this little boy having ADHD? I said, well, it's because he doesn't have ADHD. You need to go back and take an ecological history so I can find out what's going on in his house. And she did, and sure enough, there were a list of ACE. How many of you are familiar with the ACE studies, the Adverse Childhood Experiences studies? We're getting there over the years. She had a lot of adversities in his home, and a lot of his behavioral symptoms were attributable, as it turns out, to that. And so now I can't get away with that question in the clinic anymore because they know the first question I'm going to ask them is, tell me about the ecology of the child. So I'm proud to say that the students at our medical school understand the importance of an ecological history and the residents as well when they're taking care of patients. So the first objective has to do with ecology, and that means we need to know what's going on at home, what's going on in the home with the family, both the parents, if there are 2, or there may be 3 or 4, who knows, and extended family, what's going on in the neighborhood. You certainly have neighborhoods here in D.C. We have neighborhoods in Tulsa, Oklahoma that are more stressed than other neighborhoods. What's happening in school? Is this child a product of early childhood education, or was his first exposure to education when he walked into a kindergarten room totally unprepared? What's the community like? And what supports does this child and the family have in terms of faith, relatives, play opportunities? Play opportunities are critical. I really think that in our rush to make every child college eligible by second grade, we are ignoring one of the most important brain development components of child development overall, and that's the opportunity to get out and run around and play. We know that it increases things in terms of the neuroscience of what's happening in the brain, and yet like paying for things is something we ignore. Second case is Michael. This is an actual case from my internship and residency at the Children's Hospital in Philadelphia. Michael was a boy who had several emergency room visits for asthma. And his chart is about this thick. For those of you in the audience who are younger, we used to have charts. He had 3 or 4 volumes. And he was about 14 years old when I met him. During my first year as a resident, he kept coming into the emergency room. He had significant asthma attacks. And then during my third year, and then back in the good old days, the most senior physician in the hospital at night was the third-year pediatric resident. And Michael came into the emergency room one night, and he was really in trouble. Now, this is a long time ago, and we didn't have the kind of rescue medications that we have today. We didn't have support. We didn't have a PICU. We really didn't have a lot of things that we have now, and he was in great distress. So he was admitted, and I was with him, and at about 3 o'clock in the morning, he was extraordinarily tired and worn out, but so was I. And I did a dumb thing. I asked him a very bad question in terms of the context of the question. I said to him, Michael, what the hell is going on? That's a quote. Well, the answer was, briefly, he was living in a home with his mom and her third boyfriend. The 2 boyfriends before this boyfriend were very violent with the mother. He witnessed these violent attacks when he was little. It scared him, and he would go hide and wheeze. When he was a little bit older, he'd try and intervene and wheeze. And now at 14, he just didn't know what to do about the whole thing, but continued to wheeze. And once we found that out, right, we studied the ecology that he was in. We were able actually to develop some services for the mom, explain to her what was going on. The police helped us out a little bit with the boyfriend situation. As you might imagine, there were some drugs in the home. There was extreme poverty. It was really a very, very bad situation for Michael. And I can't say he miraculously got well, but he did improve. And by the time I was finished with residency, he was in some treatment. His mom was getting some counseling, and he wasn't coming to the emergency room quite as frequently. So this is the ACE study in ACE 101 here. Vince Felitti and Rob Anda. Vince was at Kaiser in California. Rob Anda was at the CDC in Atlanta. And Vince actually did the study of about 18,000 adults. And they asked adults 10 simple questions. Was this part of your early life? And they looked at child abuse and child physical abuse or sexual abuse. They looked at the home environment in terms of domestic violence, alcohol, drugs. They looked at whether there was crime in the home or the neighborhood, whether somebody had been in the family been sent to jail. And they just called these 10 adversities, asked people whether or not they were part of their early life as they remembered it. And then they did a health history because it was Kaiser Permanente, and they had a long health history on these middle-aged adults. And they found that there was a direct correlation between the level of your ACE score. If it was 0, you were more likely to be healthy. If it was 1, 2, 3, and on upwards, you were more likely to have not just emotional and sociological problems, but real diseases like heart disease and lung disease and the results of drug abuse and cigarette smoking. And on and on. And the list since they did the studies and were published in 1998, so since that time there's been thousands, really, of papers now about this, and something that I would suggest you learn something about. You can look up ACE studies at the CDC website, or just ACE studies, or ask Siri, and she'll tell you all about what's going on. But you can see here that we look at adverse childhood experiences, and then we have inserted the platform that wasn't there in the initial studies, which is the disruptive neurodevelopment that children experience when they are in high-stress situations. And then the pyramid goes on from there to early death. So now we know a little bit more about the neurobiology of what's going on. We know about the HPA axis. We know about hypothalamic pituitary interactions. So the actions are not all positive of cortisol and the overstimulation of cortisol. We know the effects on the adrenergic nervous system, and we understand what's going on with with epinephrine and norepinephrine. We understand more about brain function and structure as it reacts to neuronal, as the neuronal development reacts to stress. And now we know about epigenetics and genomics. Now, I'm only mentioning epigenetics to prove to Renee that I can pronounce the words. Don't ask me to explain epigenetics beyond this. When there's several different things that you need to know about, probably people in the audience that know a great deal more than I do, so I'm going to be careful, but things like telomere length that we need to be aware of and learn about, and we need to learn about methylation in the DNA structure that allows, as you can see in the slide, you can have modification of your histones that either vary a gene in the DNA structure. It doesn't change the structure, but it changes the function of the structure. So if you bury a gene so it's not being expressed, or you expose a gene so it is being expressed. And a lot of diseases that we're beginning to learn have a genetic base are going to be affected now by this kind of new information that's being fed to us by the geneticists and by the neuroscientists. And I'm struggling hard to understand that so that my advocacy can be a little bit more well-founded. Right now, trust me, I was a president. But what does epigenetics have to do with toxic stress? Well, child maltreatment, especially ongoing neglect, which is about 70% of all child maltreatment cases put together, creates a toxicity in what the child is exposed to. It's toxic stress. That can cause epigenetic phenomenon, and those changes cause brain health problems. There was a paper that I just wanted to make you aware of that was probably in a journal many of us don't normally read, the Journal of Interpersonal Violence. Robert Pinos and John Fairbank are co-medical directors of the National Childhood Traumatic Stress Network, which is funded by SAMHSA out of here in D.C. And looks at, initially they were looking at traumatic stress and sort of post-traumatic stress disorders in children after single events. Now, thank goodness, they are beginning, and I full disclosure, I'm on the advisory group for this center. They're beginning to look at the effect of chronic ongoing stress as well, and it's toxic stress and not just traumatic stress that they're looking at. What they found, though, is that there is a big reward for those of us who now know to assess childhood trauma and losses and toxic adversities, the ecology of a child's environment as part of our developmental history. Something that for medical students in the audience, if you're going to become pediatricians, this is going to be a very important part of your practice. We're trying to solve the problem. We're going to leave that to Renee to figure out for us, but we're trying to solve the problem of how in the world do you get paid for the time it takes to do this, and how do you develop teams. And so perhaps there's a behaviorist in your office, perhaps a social worker, but also one of the things that pediatricians should be trained to do is look at this development, not when did he walk or say first words or that kind of thing, but what's going on in that ecology, and are there differential associations that might link trauma and adversity to certain conditions. The trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, that's what TFCBT is a proven evidence-based treatment now that we can apply to these kids if we can find somebody who's trained in trauma-focused CBT to work with the child and the family. So we do have some light at the end of the tunnel, if you will, but we need to discover youth trauma histories before these behaviors occur, and they start occurring very early. Guess which grade, by the way? Yeah, I'm giving away the answer. But between kindergarten and graduating from high school, there's 13 grades. In which of those grades do you think we expel most students? Kindergarten. We kick these kids out of school because they come to school totally unprepared, particularly if they haven't been in Head Start. They're totally unprepared. They don't know how to pay attention, how to be persistent, how to try, how to listen, how to follow directions, all those kinds of things. And instead of asking them, what has been happening to you, we ask them, well, why did you do that? Get out of here. Wrong question. Why did you do that is not the right question. What's been happening to you is a much better question, and we're beginning to understand that. So if we can identify and intervene, we might be able to prevent behavioral psychiatric sequelae later on. So let's talk about this stress that I've been mentioning. Who has not in the room? Raise your hand if you've not been stressed yet this week. right? I mean, your patient isn't responding very well. You misplaced an important paper. You're worried about something at home, because we do have home lives, some of us. You lost your keys, and it was a hassle getting here this morning. And so every one of us has been stressed. But we have the ability to maintain allostasis, just like homeostasis. How many people have heard the word allostasis before? I love bringing new words. Allostasis is just like homeostasis, but instead of talking about heart rate and respiratory rate and blood pressure, we're talking about the brain's ability to remain calm in the face of some challenges. So what happens is we have stressors every day. We have major life events that affect us, and there's trauma and abuse in many people's lives, sometimes more so than others. But there's individual differences, as you can see, in how our brain perceives the stress and what our behavioral response is. So it's not just fight or flight, it's now fight or flight or freeze. That can be a but there are physiologic responses now that we are beginning to understand as we look at the neurochemistry, as we look at the epigenetics of what's going on. Allostasis means the same as homeostasis, that we keep things on an even keel in terms of our stress and distress, and we adapt, or we don't. If we don't adapt, or better said, we can't adapt because the stress is unrelenting, then we have what's called an allostatic load. Instead of being in a state of self-regulation, we have an allostatic load. So this is what things look like probably for you and me this week as we face the different stresses in our lives. We get sort of a physiologic response to the stress. That's impossible to control. You can do better, I'm told, if you know how to do yoga or you do meditation. We're beginning to link some of the neuroscience to that kind of approach to relaxation. But we have a response, and then we come. We're not going to pay you anything because it's a mental health problem, and his insurance doesn't cover mental health. It does cover organ health. So if we can get an understanding that the brain is no different than the heart, the lungs, the liver, then we will be in better shape. I want to tell you a story about this man who is Cray Deeds, who is a Virginia state senator. Anybody know about Cray Deeds and his story? It was close to here. He had a young adult son who was diagnosed with schizophrenia and was off his medication. Cray was home from the legislative session, and his son was in deep trouble. So he took him to the local hospital, and waited, the requisite 4 hours or so for a psychiatric consult. And then when somebody finally came down to see him, said, yep, his schizophrenia is really acting up. He's been off his meds, but we don't have a mental health bed available. We don't have a mental health bed available. You're going to have to take him home, get him back on his meds. So Craig took him home. And while Craig was, I believe, out cleaning out a garage or a barn or something, his son approached him with a knife. They had an encounter, and Craig with flashes, you can see in the slide, across the face, rather severely. He did survive. And after doing that, his son went into the house and died from suicide because we didn't have a mental health bed. If he'd come into the hospital with a cardiac problem, we don't have a heart bed, you're going to have to go home. If he was yellow, we don't have a liver bed, and you're going to have to go home. Does that make any sense? So one of the things we have to do is remember or remind ourselves or try and get a medical environment where we recognize that the brain is an important organ, just like the heart or the liver or the lungs. And if you have a brain health issue, you might be taken care of a little differently than somebody with a heart issue. We're not going to put leads on you and measure your blood pressure every 10 minutes, but we're going to be able to do, or we are able to do some things. We just have to recognize that they are equally important. And I found this in a local bookstore in Tulsa. They got it. Isn't this exciting? Living your best life, brain health. I was really excited. I went to the manager and I said, congratulations to you guys. This is really pretty cool. And I'll tell you about another experience at the bookstore in just a minute. Well, back in 1963, President Kennedy said that the needs of children should not be made to wait. We can say with some assurance that although children may be the victims of fate, they will not be the victims of our neglect. He was wrong. Here is a USA Today article when Baltimore experienced its riot, very close to here. And Stephanie Rawlings Blake, who is the mayor of Baltimore, said she was blaming the, quote, thugs who only want to incite violence and destroy our city. So here's my question for you. You see these guys? When did they become thugs? Were they born thugs? Did mom and dad say, oh, look at little Tommy, isn't he the cutest little thug you've ever seen? Well, they might have said that, actually. But when did these young men become thugs? It wasn't the day before the riots. It wasn't the month before the riots. It was years and years before the riots when the neuroscience implications of their brain development were beginning to apply to them, when their reaction to the toxic environments that they were living in began to have an effect on their brain development. So this thugism is not an adult or young adult problem. It's a problem for all of us in pediatrics, beginning with the very early days to pay attention. So President Kennedy said the needs of children should not be made to wait. And why is that? Well, it's because, and this was my Renee's going to smile. I said this every opportunity as state AP president that I possibly could. All adults once were children. I know that's a revelation for all of you. But think about this. All adults once were children. And Walt Disney once said, every person in the world was once a child. So now you have it from Walt Disney and Bob Bloch. This is important, and it's important because what happens right here affects what happens here, which affects what happens here, and ultimately affects what happens here. We have an obligation in pediatrics to begin to chart a life course that is going to be preventive against some of the conditions that we pay so much attention to and pay so much money for when we finally recognize that this person is now a criminal and needs to be in jail for $27,000 a year rather than $7,000 a year maybe for appropriate education as a child. Or this person has horrible diseases that we spend bazillions of dollars trying to correct because the insurance companies will pay for that. Remember that graph. All of our money comes at the end. Well, the American Academy of Pediatrics is trying to deal with that. The current president, Bernard Dreyer, is working on poverty and child health. He's been very interested in poverty for a long, long time. In our agenda for children, which lists the areas that the Academy, in the midst of focusing on 100 million different things at any given time, is also focusing on, we had epigenetics, early brain and child development, and we're still working on children and adolescents in the media and their exposure to the media, and increasing recognition that all these things are in one way or another linked together. So this poverty and child health issue is important to me. Here's two children, because it says, if you noticed on that agenda, that the American Academy of Pediatrics is dedicated to the health of all children, including these two children. The little boy, it says, when we met, you know, is that how you say quinoa? Because I kept calling her quinoa. But anyway, that's quinoa over there on your right. But it says, when we met quinoas or quinoas or whoever, his friend Ridley, for brunch, he was unhappy to learn that the bistro's chicken nuggets were not free range. And then here's his buddy, Quinoa, and the mom writes, and she posted this online, one time when Quinoa and I got separated in a busy train station, she thankfully remembered our safety training. Stay in one place, look spectacular, and don't talk to poor people. Dedicated to the health of all children, including this young man. Actually, he's an old child. This is Eddie, who's homeless. And I know you're not supposed to read slides, but I will, because this says, in tears, Eddie Martinez, who's 14, sits under the stairwell crying at the county inn in February 11th of 2015, just a year ago, in San Bernardino, California. His mother, Noreen, is in jail, and he wanders between a nearby apartment and the motel. He stuffed 2 sheets of notebook paper into his backpack. He had written, I'm losing everything in my life for good. The only thing I haven't lost yet is my life, but I hope I'll lose it soon because I can't take it anymore. Dedicated to the health of all children. So how does this change our understanding of pediatric health care? We need to look at the combination, the integration of biology, physiologic adaptations, disruptions. That's where epigenetics and neuroscience is going to inform our practice. We look at health and development, how children learn, how they learn how to behave, their physical and brain health, well-being, the ecology that surrounds them that is so heavily influential, not only in how they behave and how they act, but also in what diseases they are beginning to set the foundation for as they mature into adults. On your left is an adaptation of the early ACE pyramid that I showed you, and we're changing that now a little bit to look at the environment, to look at ecology, to look at complex trauma, to look at allostatic load, to look at coping, which is really resiliency, which we're going to talk about very quickly, and move on from there. So that part of our pediatric assessment is going to be quality of the primary interpersonal relationships, the attachment of children to their family and to their greater ecological environment. What is their exposure to a range of traumatic stressors and how are they handling them? And are they resilient? So what is resiliency? It's really important to not just bemoan the fate of kids and the negative side, but to look at what can we do about this, what can we do to promote resiliency? How do we get children to have the capacity to withstand stress and adversity? What is the capacities that they need? How do they properly adapt to stress and adversity? Who gets defined properly? We don't know yet what is really a proper approach. Can a brain that developed in an ecology of stress and adversity properly adapt to anything? The answer to that is yes, it can, but it struggles. So we'll get some help from an expert. This is my second bookstore story. When I went to the bookstore manager and congratulated him on his brain health section, I pointed out to him that he had this book by Kenneth Ginsburg, who was an AAP colleague, but he only had 1 copy. I said, you know, you need about 100 copies because I'm going to be talking to some PTAs and I'm going to tell everybody to come in the store and buy this book. And I want to cut with the profits. So in Ken's book, he talks about these 7 C's. Competence, the ability to understand, to adapt, to learn, and to be confident in an area. Confidence, developing self-confidence, which is really a very difficult thing to do if you live in an environment where either people are not talking to you at all or are talking to you in derogatory terms 99% of the time. How do you develop confidence? Something that teachers in early Head Start and pre-K and kindergarten classes really need to work on. Along with competence comes confidence and connection. Children need to learn early on that they are not little islands, that they are connected, however, to all sorts of people. And when that isn't something that they see as examples in their home, in their neighborhoods, in their extended families, that can be a problem. Character is a little bit more difficult to define and would take another hour lecture. Contribution is very important. We shouldn't learn in high school or beyond that it's important to contribute to the society in which we live. We need to understand that very, very early on. Kids begin to understand that if parents are on the right wavelength and begin to allow the child to participate in family chores, family activities, there's some things that even 2- and 3-year-old kids can do. Let them do that. And then say, well, big help. Thank you. And then build on that would be something. So when we do this environmentally ecological history, when we're talking with children and their families, these are the kind of things we need to inquire about and encourage people to do. Coping. Coping is tough. All of us in this room have learned how to cope, or we wouldn't be here. Because we've had some stresses in our lives. We've had professional stresses, academic, educational stresses, we've had personal stresses, and yet here we are. So we need to figure out how did we get here? How can we translate that into families who come from perhaps different environments, certainly than the one that I came from. Control, how to remain in control. You're not going to control the situation, but you can control yourself in certain situations, and we need to help kids learn how to do that. Those all sound like the capacities that build resilience to me. But it's so hard to do when you're 2. So remember ecology. Remember to assess the family and the child for adversities and strengths. The American Academy has been working on this. We are trying to develop a center on healthy, resilient children to build stronger families and to eventually end toxic stress, or at least put a big dent in it. Like almost everything, we're being held up in our zeal to get this done by finding appropriate funding, which in this day and age is difficult to do. But we're there, and in trying to work on this, it's a follow-up from the Resilience Project, where we talked about pediatrics being a 2-generation, at least science, probably 3 or 4 generation, really. And there are, you can see the website, this poster and other posters are available there. There's some other work that the group that worked on the Resilience Project have completed now. And with the stepping stone to our new center, whose mission is to use evidence-informed strategies to prevent and reduce the effects of toxic stress, which is a major threat to optimal brain development and the long-term health and well-being of our children and America's future. They shall not be the victims of our neglect, but for the last 55 years or so, they have been. And we need to find a way to stop that. So, what have we talked about? This is to help you formulate scintillating questions. We've talked about the importance of ecology. We've talked about the social determinants of health. Again, the structure of the environment in which a child lives, the approach to the children in terms of education. I feel embarrassed to talk about education coming from Oklahoma. We are the state that has cut education fundings more than any other state over the last 3 years, and now, because of the oil glut, we have no money. The state is bankrupt, so where do they go to make cuts? Education. Remember that graph of the Heckman equation? Remember that graph I showed you where the money is going from brain development? We have classrooms of first graders and second graders that have 50 to 60 children in them with one very, very tired teacher. And to expect them to learn anything is insane. Not much we can do about that, but if you always, like buy a lot of gasoline and stuff, but come to Oklahoma to buy it because that's where we're. So we need to look at how we're addressing our children. We need to look at ACEs. We need to look at the stress reaction. And I want you to remember that it's brain health because it's all going to come down to resiliency. We have a lot to learn yet about resiliency. And that's a great opportunity for folks who want to add something to their career pursuits. So please remember, all adults once were children. I'm very interested in your thoughts here in a minute, and we will break for questions. And David, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. So fire away with questions.
Thank you, Bob. That was great. Let's do some questions. Hello, is this on? It is on. Okay. Any questions that we can start with for Dr. Block? I enjoyed this a great deal. I find that it sense of us that it feels to me that sometimes we can be a little bit far removed from these sorts of topics and issues, but yet, as we're talking about this today, it certainly gives me the charge to learn more and do more in this regard. So thank you very much for that.
Don't forget to ask what the hell is going on.
That's right. Certainly do that.
Excuse me. Thank you. That was really a beautiful overview of such an important problem. And I wanted to know, on the topic of resilience, how much attention has been paid to nutritional status, which of course is collinear with all of the toxic stressors that contribute to ACEs in children. It was interesting you started with the Heckman equation, because there's a fascinating study that an economist in England did maybe 5 or 6 years ago. He mined a lot of big cardiovascular risk studies, and they chose that data set because there was a lot of data on behavior, lifestyle factors, and they were looking at predictors of behavior from this huge data set, and of mood in particular, thinking that mood would predict your economic behavior. Anyway, the long and short of it is that the strongest predictor of a positive outlook and resilience was fruit and vegetable intake after adjusting for everything. And it was fascinating to me as a preventive cardiologist, because we know that 99.4% of kids fall short on that element of a healthy diet, and it hits our kids at greatest risk hardest. So in terms, it's not in any way to suggest that's a simplistic solution to toxic stress, but in terms of building resilience, how much attention is paid to that in these wonderful campaigns you're championing?
I think that is an excellent question, because nutrition is, you're correct, is so often overlooked, and it's probably overlooked because none of us, at least I can only speak for myself, we're trained in looking at nutrition. We're beginning to see some emphasis on that. Some of the emphasis is a little strange, because it's, we've got children now like Ridley, who wanted to know whether his chicken nuggets were free range or not. But I think most physicians that are middle-aged and older know very little about nutrition unless they've specifically studied that. The Academy has a very active committee that looks at nutrition. They've been stressed over the years themselves because of the war between breastfeeding and formula companies. We're working on that, or they now are working on that. But I think it's a very important issue. I'm glad you brought it up. It's something we have a lot to learn about, and learn about the structure of how does a vegetable get converted, if you will, into a usable substance in the body, which of course includes the brain. So I hope we'll get more attention to it in the future.
The specific role in the epigenome is fascinating, because of the micronutrient deficiency. When you're missing those food groups, that will affect your histone acetylation and all those D vitamin-dependent pathways.
Isn't it interesting that we have cardiologists, we have a child-abuse pediatrician, and we're talking about molecular change at the DNA level? I think that's what will promote us to pay or encourage us and our colleagues to pay more attention to something that we really haven't understood in the past. I'm hoping that becomes a more important part of pre-medical education. There's a lot of things that we're doing in medical school that need to be done in the pre-med years, because there's so much more science to teach when we get people into medical school. But we need to take advantage of earlier years. I wouldn't be upset if we started teaching some of this stuff appropriately in high school to kids who think at least that they're going to go into school in the health science. Good question here.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Block.
Yeah.
And it's great to have you here on Doctor's Day. I know the question you would probably ask David would be, who's going to be the NCAA champion? And I want to reassure you that he now believes it will be North Carolina. But nevertheless, I want to give you a sense of some promise here, and I'm not going to speak about it because I'm not the expert, but we do have some people here at Children's National that are working on this topic, and I think you're championing it and advocating for it has really opened the door for a lot of people to think differently. And Lee Beers, who's here in the audience, along with Georgetown, received a $6 million grant, I think, to address this very topic. And if Lee, maybe you and Dr. Block could have a little interchange on that, because we're so excited to have the opportunity here in Washington, where we have just as many problems with in parts of our city that mimic what goes on around the world, or Oklahoma, that it's a great burden. So, Lee?
Yeah.
Lee, before you start, I just need to remind you that when you're talking about North Carolina and Kansas, you forgot about Buddy Hield.
Who?
I'll make the final four.
Yeah.
I'll move on from that topic. I may start inducing some toxic stress and move on. But Bob, you and I talked about this a little bit last night, but for the benefit of all, Kurt, is what Kurt is referring to is that we've just recently developed a partnership between Children's and Georgetown called the Early Childhood Innovation Network. And our overall goal is to focus on the community of Washington, D.C. And decrease the impact of toxic stresses in children ages 0 to 5. And we'll be working on a couple of different levels. From a systemic level, we'll be working across the sectors of primary care, early childhood education, and social serving agencies to decrease the barriers to integration between those silos, so that we're all really working together for the care of children. And we'll also be funding and evaluating innovative interventions within these settings, so that we can really get at some of the things that we know already about how to build resilience in children, but learn more about that and figure out how those things work best in Washington, D.C. And so I think, we talked a little last night about connecting further on that, because I think there's a lot of synergies in the work we're doing locally that we would like to bring together with the work that's happening nationally. And anyone who wants to join us in our journey, we're very happy to do that. We just launched the network in January, so we're very new, but we're getting ready to launch our first pilot in the fall.
That's great, thank you. There's also a center evolving in Houston, and Dr. Chris Greeley is working with his medical school and community in a public health role within the Department of Pediatrics to start looking at the same kinds of issues. So my hope is that we will have not just one center at the Academy, but several centers around the country that can then start coordinating the work that they're doing and sort of launch this project in greater style. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much for wonderful talk on developmental pediatrician. And I just wanted to amplify what you said in study that was done on early and in premature, showing how significant impact on, especially on children who come from poverty, that while children who are middle class, early education, IQ, on those children, just
great. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I was in pediatrics for almost 10 years and then went into child psychiatry, so I'm so glad to be hearing about this. The question I have is any suggestions you have for advocacy? For advocacy? Because I'm noticing that no matter how much we do, we're constantly working in a vacuum of resources, and it almost doesn't matter how much effort you put into it. When you don't have the resources, you're left standing there asking, what am I doing this for then? So with advocacy days in AAP and ACAP this spring, what would you suggest to remind all of our congressmen that they were once children too? Because it seems to fall.
But many still are.
Yes.
I don't want to turn it into a political discussion, but, you know, the Murphy bill going up for markup and all this kind of thing, what would you recommend or any pointers you could give?
Well, you know, that's an excellent question, and I don't have a definitive answer. I once met with a staff person who was the liaison between the U.S. Senate and the Congressional Budget Office. And I asked her why we couldn't develop some traction with bills that might start funding appropriately early childhood health and well-being kinds of programs. And her answer was actually politically correct, but discouraging, because she said, well, you know, the House and the Senate are really only interested in 2 to 6 year timeframes. And if we start doing things with prenatally and early on with infants and with children and then have to wait until they're adults, there's no way they can score that. And if they can't score it, they're not going to write the bill. Having said that, your question then becomes how do you scale an almost impossibly high wall to get people to change that way of thinking? I don't think that's going to happen in the very near future, given the inability of people to have conversations about important topics right now. But I think that the concept, and I know it's just words, but the concept of brain health, linking this to everything else that we invest in health other than brain health, will help us. Because if we can get people to understand the cost savings, you know, we're not going to advocate for doing the right thing and being kind to our children. We have to just talk money. And we have to get people to understand that James Heckman should not be the only person in the world who understands this trajectory. I think that's the tack that we're going to take through the through the AAP, through the Washington office here, and Bernard's going to work a lot with poverty, which influences, by the way, access to nutritional foods rather than, you know, non-nutritional foods. So I think we're hoping for a groundswell where people are going to be understanding better, particularly those who pay the bills, how they might be able to save some money down the road. And, you know, maybe we find it in the Senate where people get elected 2 or 3 times, and so they've got an 18-year trajectory. So kids that are born when they're first elected are going to be going to college when they finish their 3rd term. We need to start talking politically, I think, in that kind of language to them. Whether it will work or not, and we can get people to agree or not, I can't speak to, but it's a hope. So I see 9 o'clock on the clock, and I want everybody to get off to your regular work. Thank you so much for inviting me again, David. It's a great pleasure.
Thanks, everyone. Again, let me remind you that if you have time, we'd love to see you upstairs at the 5th floor research atrium for a celebration that's been sponsored by our terrific nursing colleagues in honor of Doctors Day. So please do join us upstairs. Thanks again. Thank you.